Welcome everyone to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and this seminar that we do together with the Swedish Defence University about maritime disputes in East Asia. My name is Björn Jerdén and I'm a director of the Asia program at the Institute. If you have been following the news about the Asia Pacific, as I guess most of you have, in the last 6, 7, 8 years, you have noticed that much of the hotspots in the region concerns maritime disputes. These disputes take place both in the East China Sea, where they concern China and Japan, but also in the South China Sea, where they concern China and a number of Southeast Asian countries. Recently, we have seen new developments. The Philippines seem to have made a pivot away from its close reliance on the United States toward China. In the US, we have a new president who have made signals that leads to a lot of questions how this will affect the disputes. So we are very happy today to have 3 distinguished speakers that will cover these issues. First, we have Steve Chan from the University of Colorado. Steve is a college professor of distinction at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he's a professor of political science and director of the Ferentz Residence Academic Program. Steve has, for the last decades, written widely on topics concerning international relations in East Asia. He has published almost 20 books and over 160 academic journal articles and book chapters. So he is a very prolific scholar indeed. In recent years, Steve's research focus have been how contemporary international relations in the region relates to general theories of international relations. To my left, we have Eva Hansson, who is a coordinator at the Forum for Asian Studies at Stockholm University and a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science. Eva's research concerns mostly Vietnam, but she also has a focus on other countries in the region and can provide us insights how China's presence is perceived in these countries. As I said, Eva is a coordinator at the Forum for Asian Studies, and the Forum for Asian Studies is an initiative by the Faculty of Social Sciences at Stockholm University. And if you have an interest in what's going on in Asia, I could really recommend you to look up their websites because they have a lot of public events going on. And last but not least, Stefan Lundqvist. Stefan, it's a lieutenant commander within the Royal Swedish Navy, which he joined in 1987. He is also a PhD student at Åbo Academy University in Finland, where he does research about maritime security and operations assessment. Stefan is just about to finish his PhD dissertation, so big congratulations to you about that. So without further ado, I will invite our first speaker today, Professor Steve Chan, please.
Well, thank you very much, Björn, for your very nice and generous introduction. Thank you. And thanks to all the audience here. I realize how busy your daily lives must be, so I appreciate your taking the time to attend this event. I would be remiss if I did not single out Linus Hagström and also Anna Karim Johnson for being such good, wonderful hosts. They are just indispensable in making this visit of mine possible and pleasant. So thank you very, very much. One cannot ask for a more gracious host, more generous colleague. I really mean it, so thank you. And of course, I want to also thank Stefan and Eva for taking time from their life, from their busy daily life to come here and to comment. So thank you again for being here. The topic of my talk is China's maritime disputes, focusing especially on the South China Sea conflicts. This paper was written before Donald Trump was elected to be the President of the United States. And if I may just confess, full disclosure, confess to my own bias, I'm still trying to overcome the shock. I have been proven again and again and again how wrong I have been. I have ended up with lots of eggs on my face, as they say in the United States. So this is a way of my saying to you, you have to take what I say to you today with a grain of salt. I'm more likely to be proven wrong than right. But I also say in a more serious way that Donald Trump's election has thrown in a monkey wrench, introduced a great deal of uncertainty about the evolution of the South China disputes. There are today far more questions than answers about what his administration is likely to do. Many of you have heard that he has questioned the burden sharing of countries like South Korea and Japan, demanding that these two allies of the United States to ante up more money to pay for the military presence of the United States there. He has promised to rescind or to cancel the nuclear agreement with Iran. He has already announced that he will withdraw from the TPP, which was a very big part of the Obama strategy of pivot to Asia. And of course, in Europe, he has made statements that raises question about the U.S. commitment to some countries in Eastern and Central Europe who are members of NATO. So in all these respects, what I'm trying to say is that there are more questions today to be asked. What many people, including myself, would have assumed to be a settled matter, that the answers are clear. Today, I don't think it's still to be taken for granted, these answers. They are much more up in the air. So this is a way of trying to say caveat emptor, right? That you have to take my comments with a grain of salt. The other point that I want to say before I get into the substance of this talk is this. Some of you may have come to this talk expecting that I will give you a legal or even a historical account of the origins of these disputes. I'm afraid that I'm going to disappoint you because I'm not going to talk much about the legal or historical aspects of these disputes. Instead, I'm going to offer some comments about theories of dispute settlement and dispute escalation. Specifically, what does it take to start a dispute? What does it take to settle a dispute? What are the prospects for these disputes to be settled? And which countries, counterparts of China, are more likely to come to an agreement with China? So the comments that I make are more analytical than historical or legal. And of course, I will welcome your comments at the end of the presentation. Of course, I will also look forward eagerly to whatever Stefan have to say about my paper. One more thing, and then I will move on to the substance of the paper. This morning, Björn was very gracious in accompanying me to the Foreign Ministry of Sweden, where I made some audacious comments, and just want to share these comments with you and putting in context the South China Sea disputes. My audacious comments are as follows. That I actually would not worry so much about these disputes, maritime disputes, escalating. My own personal view is that these disputes are quite well contained. that I would not worry too much about these disputes getting out of hand, escalating into a point of hot confrontations. In fact, all the disputing countries have exercised restraint. One example is that they have so far resorted to Coast Guard vessels when they get into dispute situations instead of calling up the Navy. The Navy of the respective countries have so far refrained from getting involved. And many of you have heard about artificial islands built by China in the South China Sea. My own personal view is that these islands are more a symbolic statement rather than anything of strategic value. If anything, these islands cannot sustain human life without outside supplies. And in the case of a war, they would be sitting ducks. They are easy targets to be annihilated and taken out. And to put it very bluntly, China does not have, at the present time, the military means to fight a war in the South China Sea, period. Instead, as I offered in my meeting with the Swedish diplomat, I would be far more worried about, number one, North Korea. That Obama has already told Trump that the number one issue that he has to turn his attention to will be North Korea. North Korea is a ticking time bomb. Already it is widely understood or assumed that North Korea today has the capability of launching intermediate range missiles with a nuclear warhead mounted on top of it. So already Japan and South Korea are within the gun sights of North Korea. My own thinking is that Washington, D.C., the Trump administration will have to very quickly come to some kind of decision point, not long after Trump assumes office. Some of you may or may not know that during the Bill Clinton administration, the United States literally came within hours of launching an airstrike against North Korea. So it is not out of consideration that Trump may pull the trigger. If that were to happen, all bets are off. Northeast Asia would be thrown into turmoil. While there's no doubt that North Korea would be defeated in a war, there's no question that the North Korean regime will go down the tube. But they will also take someone else along with them down the tube. That is to say, they will inflict some very heavy damage on their way down the tube. So that the city of Seoul, for example, could very well be severely devastated. Now, why do I raise this point? And we can go into that. At the talk I had with the Swedish diplomats, I emphasized that North Korea has very few options, very few channels of communication. Certainly the North Koreans do not believe in the trustworthiness of the South Koreans, the Japanese, and not even the Chinese. The one country that can still offer them a channel of communication to reach out, to reach the outside world, is this country. Sweden has historically kept a diplomatic presence, and Sweden has had a good reputation for being an honest broker, or at least a source to be relied on to pass on information. And to the extent that Sweden now is a member of the Security Council, the good offices of Sweden would be even more necessary than ever before. You're talking about a North Korean regime that is, to put it simply, a bit crazy, and perhaps someone else will use the same adjective to describe the Donald Trump administration. So there have to be some sane minds, someone who will act as an adult in the room. Okay. The other point, so I say, compared to North Korea, the South China Sea disputes are very mild, I think. And the other point that I want to underscore before I go into the substance has to do with another trouble spot. Donald Trump has already made it very clear that he would rescind or cancel the nuclear deal with Tehran, Iran, to curtail the nuclear program of Iran. Of course, as you all know, this was an agreement that was entered into not only by the United States and Iran, but also Britain, France, Germany, and EU. And the United Nations also endorsed it voting. The question is this: how much is the worth of a treaty when you can tear up the agreement after a new administration assumes office. And to what extent, one may ask whether what happens in Tehran, Iran, the United States withdrawing from the nuclear deal with Iran, could have implications for North Korea. Should the North Koreans trust in any deal that they may reach with the United States, even with China and Russia as participants, if the United States cancels the treaty with Tehran? So these two issues, to my mind, is very much interrelated, and to the extent that Donald Trump follows up on his pledge to withdraw from the nuclear deal with Iran, then the next question is, what is Iran going to do? And also, what are Britain, Germany, France, and EU going to do? Are they just going to sit by and let this agreement to be abolished, dismantled, or are they going to say something? This is very concerning, in part because, if I may just go on with one more, I'm sorry that I have not gotten to the South China Sea. I hope you indulge me already, maybe speaking too much. In the context of 4 countries that can be described as rogue states, the axis of evil. You know that Saddam Hussein, you know Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and of course they are North Korea and Iran. The irony, from my point of view, is that we have learned that Saddam Hussein actually did not have weapons of mass destruction. That the Swedish diplomat Hans Blix could have very well worked out a deal relying on inspection. But the United States insisted on invading Iraq. And we also know that Muammar Gaddafi actually had offered voluntarily to dismantle his program of weapons of mass destruction, inviting international inspection. The question is very simply this, and I think the answer you all know is what happened to Saddam Hussein and what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. They are both dead. And of the rogue states, the other 2 rogue states, Iran has been developing nuclear weapons, and North Korea actually has a handful of nuclear devices. And it is ironic that these 2 countries have not been attacked. So if you are a logical person, the inference you draw is that having no nuclear weapons is an invitation to be attacked. That if you do not want to be attacked, in fact, you should go for nuclear weapons. The actions of the United States and Britain were self-defeating, in my view, vis-a-vis Muammar Gaddafi and also Saddam Hussein. And this again relates to my earlier point about why North Korea is such a big concern. If there is one hotspot in the world that's going to blow up, most likely it would be there and not the South China Sea. And now I apologize for this long-winded speech, but I just want to put the South China Sea disputes in context. In comparison to these other issues, I think the South China Sea disputes are quite mild, under control. And you may disagree with me, and I'm very happy to have your contribution, your questions during the questions and answers period. My sense is that if there are 2 words that I can use to describe the situation as far as China is concerned, it is simply this: let time take care of things. Let things mature. Don't force a showdown. Don't force a solution. The 2 words that I have in mind is assertive reaction. China will not push things, but China will certainly retaliate. If China feels that it has been pushed, it will certainly retaliate with force. Okay? But the general strategy for South China Sea and for also the East China Sea dispute, Senkaku Islands and Diaoyu Islands, is the same. We are willing to shelve these disputes for the time being. This in part reflects a Chinese attitude. The Chinese attitude is that time is on our side. The trend is in our favor. We can wait things out. And that time also is our ally because as long as we do not make mistakes, the situation may turn to our favor because our adversary make mistakes. That is to say, to extend the opportunity to others to make their mistakes. And most recently, of course, Donald Trump's talk about withdrawing from the TPP has raised a lot of questions about the reliability of U.S. commitments. In this case, the United States has done China more favor than China could ever accomplish by its own actions. Here's an example of what I mean by letting our adversary make mistakes. All right, let me see. Björn, I hope you're keeping time. I'm already halftime, halfway through my time, and I have not even turned the title page yet. I apologize, I really do. I want to present to you a puzzle, an unconventional interpretation. I don't know whether you would agree with me or not, but here's my interpretation about the South China Sea situation. What I propose to you is this, that all the disputing countries are in fact in agreement. They actually agree with each other. Whereas most of the public media, many people are worried about things getting out of hand, that these countries cannot get along, right? They are at each other's throat, that the situation can get out of hand. I actually argue to you at the very start, outset, the puzzle that I have is that they are actually in agreement. You say, Steve, you must be crazy. What do you mean by they are in agreement? I say they are in agreement about the following. They agree to disagree. They agree to actually let things go on without forcing without forcing a solution. And in other words, all the disputing countries are in agreement to accept a deadlock for the time being. They will rather accept a deadlock to solving the dispute once and for all. The deadlock is actually, to all of them, more preferable to settling the dispute. How come? Well, by backward inference, and here's the analytical part comes in. I'm going to start with this proposition that these disputing countries are in agreement, that they all prefer deadlock rather than to settle the dispute, and then say, what could incline Manila, Hanoi, Brunei to all agree with Beijing that it's preferable to postpone settlement? What could be on their mind? Well, it seems to me perhaps it makes sense for Beijing to say, let time take care of things. Because we have confidence that over time, as time goes on, China will become stronger. If most political scientists' prognosis is correct, then one can expect China's relative capabilities or power to further increase down the road. So perhaps one can understand why China prefers deadlock, because it can get a better bargain. It can settle the dispute more to its favor, to its advantage, 10 years from now or 20 years from now. But then that doesn't make sense from the point of view of Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, or Vietnam. Because if Chinese power, relative power, is going to increase, it must mean that they will suffer a relative decline. That if a settlement were to be reached 10, 20, 30 years from now, then they will have a weaker bargaining position. They will get weaker terms of settlement. So why would these countries want to wait? One possible explanation is the United States. The US provides the trump card, the wild card. To the extent that the Southeast Asian countries, and Japan would be part of it too, in the East China Sea dispute, to the extent that they're willing to accept deadlock for the time being, it indicates implicitly to me, by backward inference, they think that even though China's power may increase in the future, China's power can be checked. And who is going to check China's power? The only country that can check China's power is the United States. So by accepting deadlock, Manila, Hanoi, Kuala Lumpur, and even Tokyo are saying, we have confidence in the United States joining these disputes to support us. Because otherwise, it would not make sense for them to accept a deadlock. Am I making sense to you at all? So acceptance for a deadlock is actually a vote of confidence in the US support for these countries. But quickly then, the next question logically follows. Are these countries' expectations of the United States involving itself in these maritime disputes, to what extent are their expectations reasonable, especially in the Trump administration? Is the United States rethinking about its commitments? To the extent that Trump has raised questions about the US commitment to South Korea and Taiwan, to the extent that Trump has even raised questions about the US commitment to NATO, to what extent can the Southeast Asian countries' confidence in the United States be warranted? So here I'm just raising a question. Would the Trump administration, would my logic still obtain? So here's one possibility, that an acceptance of deadlock is a vote of confidence in the United States coming to the help of the Southeast Asian countries, that the US will have these countries back, that China will not be able to throw its weight around. The second possible reason for these countries to accept deadlock and not settlement has to do with domestic politics. That is to say, even though you think China may be getting stronger in the future, you don't think any deal with China can work out because you are not going to get your domestic constituents, like opposition parties, like the Congress of the United States, to come along and support you and to ratify the deal that you have concluded with China. So the prospect of domestic opposition, the difficulty of ratifying your deals with a foreign country, can stop you from negotiating such a deal to begin with. You are deterred from coming to a settlement with China in part because you are not confident that you can deliver a deal. And the same thing applies to China. Chinese leaders may be leery of coming to a settlement with the Philippines, in part because the Chinese leaders may be worried about internal factions or factions internal to the Communist Party. They are rival politicians jockeying for power, or maybe a nationalistic public opinion will not put up with China reaching some kind of compromise with the Southeast Asian countries. So the difficulties of gaining domestic approval could be another reason why countries are willing to kick the can down the road, to postpone, to just play for time, right? Again, if you think I'm being ridiculous, just think of the difficulties that President Obama had in concluding the nuclear deal with Tehran. He has so many Republican senators who were opposed to this deal, right? There's so much skepticism that the only reason this agreement came to be a deal was because the Republicans in the Senate could not have stopped a filibuster by the Democratic senators, right? There were more votes actually in the US Congress against the Iran deal than votes in favor of the deal. The only reason that it passed was because you require 60 votes to stop a filibuster. And that's the only reason that Obama could push it through. But even today, with him leaving office, Donald Trump, as I've said before, can cancel the deal, right? So domestic uncertainties could be another reason why, to many of these countries, it is more worthwhile to keep disputes alive than to bury them. For many countries, many leaders who want to rally nationalistic sentiments, using foreign enemies as a scapegoat to get votes, to gain the votes of your domestic public by standing up to foreigners, by playing the nationalist card. From their point of view, it's far more worthwhile to keep a dispute going on than to bury, especially if you can be vulnerable to criticisms from your opposition, domestic opposition, for somehow being weak, lacking backbones when dealing with foreigners. So the easier way is to keep a dispute going. But having said that, and I need to speed up, having said that, none of the countries, in my view, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia or Brunei, or Japan, and China, are eager to force the issue, to escalate the tension to the point of a military clash. None of them is interested in doing that. And one reason has to do with their tight economic interdependence with China. China is the #1 trade partner for Japan, for South Korea, for Taiwan, for Malaysia, for the Philippines. I think maybe China is #2, and for Vietnam, certainly. And China was the #1 trade partner, even for the United States, overtaking Canada in late 2015. So they have too much economic interest at stake to force the issue to escalate military tension. So my prognosis is that the disputes will linger, they will simmer, they will continue, but the danger of escalation will be contained, that none of the sides are willing to come to the table yet. Now, I think I've already come to the...
You got a few more minutes. Please go ahead.
So, in the absence of a decisive leader, the default policy is inaction. For any and every government, always remember, when you have domestic divisions, when your bureaucracies cannot agree, when your people are divided of two different opinions, what is the most likely outcome? What's the default policy? It's inaction, do nothing. And that's what I'm saying is taking place in South China Sea. It's inaction, the default choice. Waiting becomes the default choice. Because it takes decisiveness to mobilize support, to change the current policy, to do something different. But it's easy to go along with the status quo. All right, let me just perhaps say, so I have a number of hypotheses, and I'll be happy later on to take your names if you want me to send the slides, the PowerPoints to you. Okay, I'm very happy to email them to you. But let me just go with one more hypothesis. I have quite a few hypotheses. It takes, in fact, and this is something very contrary to people who support and love democracy. My argument is that when you have an authoritarian, strong leader, you're more likely to reach out and settle a dispute. Because a strong authoritarian leader does not have to protect his or her political flank. This leader does not expect domestic opposition. This person can afford to make concessions without being accused of having sold out his country. So it takes a Mao Zedong, for example, or maybe a Deng Xiaoping to invite Nixon to come to Beijing. It takes an authoritarian leader. Whereas a leader for a divided country, especially when they come to close to election time, when Congress and the White House are controlled by different parties, you have a weak leader. Weak leader in the sense that you cannot carry the country with you to negotiate a settlement. So the stronger a country's leader is, more authoritarian, paradoxically, the more likely a dispute is going to be settled. And the implication is this. I will say this and then shut up because you've been very patient with me. As China becomes more democratic, or at least pluralistic, as Chinese leadership becomes more divided, as rival competing factions emerge among the Chinese leadership, the likelihood of settling foreign disputes is going to go down, decline. In fact, if anything, these rival competing politicians' factions are more likely to appeal to mass sentiments. They are more likely to rally public opinion to get them to join their partisan competition. And we know one thing, I think. The mass public in most countries tend to be more nationalistic than elite opinion. That the elites actually have pretty moderate views of foreign policy. It's the mass public that tends to be more bellicose or belligerent. The Chinese public, in their online comments, have consistently accused the Chinese government for being too weak, too vacillating, and for not standing up for China's national interest. So the leaders of China have been accused, right, for too anxious to please the United States and other disputing countries. So my argument is that paradoxically, as Chinese politics becomes more decentralized, more fragmented, as leaders there become more vulnerable to backlashes, political opposition, you are more likely to see Chinese foreign policy that is more belligerent, more bellicose. Okay. I want to hear these people's talk, so I'm going to shut up, okay? Please forgive me, I am not very good in managing my time, so I apologize.
Steve, thank you very much, and I think you managed it just fine, actually. It was only 1 minute too long, so don't worry about that. And we welcome our next speaker, Dr. Eva Hansson from Stockholm University. And I should tell everyone, if you're active on social media during the seminar, please use our hashtag #UIEvent. Eva, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting talk as well. And thank you, Björn, for the invitation to speak here today. I think it's probably mandatory to say something about the Trump election nowadays in any seminar. So I just wanted to add to your comment that I was just in a post-election seminar the other day, and a professor at the Swedish Defence College, he actually said that this, I quote, this could be very well the end of the world, of the liberal world order as we know it after the Second World War. Perhaps that's a dramatic expression in analysis of the election, but I think probably we will perhaps need to rethink a lot of things depending on what we will see happening. As Professor Chan mentioned, the US has already said the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, trade deal is null and void, and so on. So we will see a lot of discussions around those things. I would like to delve into some of the issues mentioned by Professor Chan a little bit more. And I would like to call this the people variable. I think that we have paid too little attention to the people variable in understanding the current conflicts in Southeast Asia, at least, and probably in general, by the way. In order to do this, I would like to start with actually start in the Cold War. And I think that the Cold War and the Cold War dynamics are still important for our understanding of, for example, different conflicts, ongoing conflicts. We could actually, with some prominent other researchers, question if the Cold War in Asia, did it ever end? Hyunwook Kwon, a really interesting researcher on the Cold War, stated that the Cold War was a conflict which had no real beginning, but it had a definite end. But this could also be questioned because some of the dynamics of Cold War is actually lingering on. For example, in the division of North and South Korea, and also in countries like Vietnam and so on. As we know, the Cold War was in fact not a Cold War in Asia or in the world outside the relations between Soviet Union, Europe, and the US. I don't know, actually. Well, this is I just want to show you this slide because I think it's fairly interesting. It's from the Uppsala database, and it has counted battle deaths by region during the entire Cold War. And the white areas are battle deaths in Asia, and the grayish areas are in the Middle East, North Africa, and black areas, sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. But we see that there were plenty of battle deaths throughout the Cold War, intense period of hot conflict, actually, with a lot of civil wars going on and so on. And looking just at Asia, this is also from the Uppsala database. We see some bumps, and they are mainly the Korea War, and the other one is mainly the Vietnam War, and also the politicide in Indonesia could be traced there somewhere as well. So a lot of intense fighting went on during this Cold War period, but also something else. And that is what I would like to think about as when people during the 20th century actually moved from being subjects to citizens. And this move from being subjects to becoming citizens involved their actual organization and mobilization for claiming rights and so on and so forth. This went on throughout Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America throughout this period with varying results on the political regimes in question. And this has relevance, I would say, for understanding of today's conflict. I would like to take the example of Vietnam, which is a very important actor in the South China conflict. In Vietnam, there was a rebirth of people's movements, actually occurring at the same time as there was some intellectuals who were attacking a Chinese bauxite mining project in the central highlands of Vietnam. This was around 2005, 2006, when Vietnam was also in a period when we saw political blogs emerge, we saw a democracy movement emerge, and so on and so forth. And the bauxite conflict involved China to a very high degree because it was the Chinese that wanted to extract bauxite in Vietnam, and people suspected that deals had been done between Chinese leaders and the Communist Party leaders in Vietnam for private gains and so on. And this started to be discussed in media and in social media, and in fact gave rise to the first anti-China protests. And they started in very modest forms, gathering in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City on Sundays, and continued with a very, very good regularity. So week after week, we saw this anti-China protests emerging against the bauxite mining project. And then we'll jump ahead because I know I have very little time. And then we move on to 2014. 2014, something happened in the South China Sea. The Chinese SOE moved in an oil rig into the disputed areas. And this led to protests by the Vietnamese government, but not very vocal. If you would ask the more patriot mobilizers of civil society in Vietnam. So they were really not satisfied with their government's reaction to this blunt move, what they saw as this blunt move of aggression from the Chinese government. Immediately, protests started to emerge, and this is just to show where the oil rig was actually placed. So you can see the dotted line, the red dotted line is the U-shaped line that the territory that is claimed by China, and the black little oil rig there is where it was actually placed. So what happened immediately were strong protests across Vietnam. People went out in the streets screaming Hong Sa, Chung Sa, the names of the Paracels and Spratly Islands in Vietnamese, and also protested the aggression as they saw it by China. So here's some more footage of and some other pictures. There was also a structural basis for actually really widespread protest. My time is up. 2 minutes. So in the southern parts of the country, where there had been a lot of labor protests going on and so on, there was really fertile ground for getting a real anti-China protest movements going on. So in the industrial zones of the south, factories were burnt down by people who were angry at the Chinese and their acts in the South China Sea, and it really mixed with all other sentiments. For example, discontent workers in these zones, even the pro-democracy movement became involved, and so on and so forth. So it became an alliance between the anti-China protesters and all other forces that were actually in opposition to the party. This was really bad news for the party, because what started as anti-China protests started to emerge to become a threat to regime security. And looking at, for example, Vietnamese foreign policy and how security is viewed by the Vietnamese party state, included in the security conception is also economic security, not only territorial security and sovereignty, but also economic security and, in particular, regime security. To stay in power, the Communist Party wants to stay in power. So this was really bad news for the Communist Party, actually, because all of a sudden they realized that this could actually be threatening to the communist regime itself. So they started to crack down on the anti-China protests. And this also meant that the traditional foe of Vietnam, which has been China, could not be used anymore as a nationalist. They could not anymore play the nationalist card, so to speak, to say that we legitimize our regime and so on, because of the historical circumstances, because we have been predestined to lead this country and so on. So in comparison to China, the Communist Party was no longer able to use these kind of arguments anymore. Yeah, and as a comment also to Professor Chan's talk here, I would also like to complicate the way that this people factor may affect policy decisions and so on, and for space for policy, foreign policy making in different ways in democracies and, for example, in authoritarian regimes. Because I think that also, even in dictatorships such as Vietnam, they are at least as vulnerable to oppositional movements and so on. And in particular, when regime security is put at the central spot of security concern by the state. So I think one could also open up a bit this categorization of different regime types and how vulnerable they would be to pressure from society and so on. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Eva. And then we have our third speaker, Lieutenant Commander Stefan Lundqvist from Swedish Defence University and Åbo Academy University in Finland. Please, Stefan.
Thanks, Björn, and thanks all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for allowing me the opportunity to speak here today. And it's a pleasure for me being here with you. So what I will present here is based on the research that I have undertaken in pursuit of my thesis titled Continuity and Change in Post-Cold War Maritime Security, a study of maritime strategies pursued by the US, Sweden and Finland, outlined in 6 research articles. And I expect, as stated here, to defend my thesis at Åbo Academy University in spring next year. In my research, I have mainly, although not exclusively, drawn on the structural realism tradition. The school of thought also informs what I will present here today, focusing on providing a US perspective on East Asia. The maritime security of East Asia, I would argue, is a subset of that of the Asia-Pacific region. Here, maritime powers such as Australia, China, Japan, South Korea and Taiwan interact with each other and the US, but so do also India, which maritime security interests now extends beyond the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea into the Western Pacific, illustrating its more vigorous foreign policy. In recent decades, East Asian states have been particularly active promoting their national interests and economic growth through multilateral cooperation and trade agreements, but also of linking them to security. While the level of distrust and rivalry between them has thwarted by multilateral defense industrial cooperation, I would argue that ASEAN have taken on lead roles in fostering dialogues on trade and managing threats at the low end of the conflict spectrum, such as the widespread piracy and smuggling of drugs and arms in the South China Sea. The main and intractable security problems of East Asia, which include a maritime security dimension and directly involve the US for its security guarantees, are first the nuclear threat posed by North Korea, as mentioned by Professor Chan, directly primarily towards Japan and South Korea. Second, we have the China-Taiwan conflict. Third, we have the Chinese build-up of its maritime law enforcement capacity, its anti-access area denial capacity, its territorial assertiveness, its appetite for marine resources in the South China Sea, and its biased interpretation of international maritime law. And finally, the build-up of naval capabilities among the coastal states of the region. Since 2013, when China began its intense and extensive land reclamation on 7 disputed reefs in the South China Sea, patterns of economic and maritime security cooperation on managing non-traditional threats are superimposed by patterns of national rivalry over resources, territorial influence, as well as naval power in East Asia. In line with structural realism's predictions, the amount of power politics in the foreign policy of China has increased in tandem with the increase in its military power. As a result, the intergovernmental ASEAN maintains a key role in low politics such as economics, trade, social affairs, and the management of non-traditional security issues. However, its role in managing issues on high politics has been marginal, a fact apparent in its weak performance in managing territorial disputes and the increasing security pressure affecting its member states. In accordance with structural realist predictions that states will assign low priority to non-security objectives in times of high security pressure, small and medium powers in East Asia have sought to maintain their economic relationships with China while deepening their security relationships with the US, regardless of ideology. Among them, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, which signed this US strategic partnership in 2013, stands out. So do also the ongoing process of changing the Japanese post-World War II pacifist constitution and the US-Philippines 2000 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. The US Sea Services employ a joint cooperative maritime strategy in East Asia, as well as in other regions of the world. The 2015 US Department of Defense Asia-Pacific Maritime Security Strategy sets 3 maritime security objectives and 4 lines of effort to achieve them. First, the freedom of the seas should be safeguarded. Second, conflict and coercion must be deterred. And third, adherence to international law should be promoted. The first line of effort, strengthening US military capacity to deter conflict and coercion and respond decisively when needed, involves a comprehensive weapons modernization program for power projection centered on forward presence and contingency management. The second line of effort, working with US allies and partners from Northeast Asia to the Indian Ocean to build regional capacity to address potential challenges in their waters, places emphasis on US alliances. The networked information architecture and the key role assigned to the US Coast Guard are novelties, serving the US need for maritime domain awareness. The third line of effort, leveraging military diplomacy to build greater transparency, reduce risk of miscalculation and conflict, and promote shared maritime rules of engagement, leverages the traditional role of naval diplomacy. Also, the 2014 US-China Memorandum of Understanding on Rules of Behavior for Safety of Air and Maritime Encounters resemble that signed with the Soviet Union in 1972. The multilateral approach of a fourth line of effort, strengthening regional security institutions and encouraging development of an open and effective regional security architecture, is well illustrated by the US use of the ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting Plus and its expert working group on maritime security. But there are challenges to this US strategy. This week, doubts were voiced regarding China's economy due to a looming debt crisis. Notwithstanding, the capabilities of the People Liberation Army and China's maritime law enforcement agencies are continuously growing. As widely known, the Chinese Coast Guard, defined by the US Office of Naval Intelligence as the world's largest Coast Guard, has been active at various points of dispute, from the Scarborough Shoal standoff in 2012 and to the exploration rig crisis between Beijing and Hanoi of the Paracels in spring 2014, as Eva showed to us. The large cutter depicted on the slide will soon be commissioned into the Chinese Coast Guard. What makes this particular cutter remarkable is that it is a maritime law enforcement version of a Type 54 frigate of the People Liberation Army Navy. This class of warship has earned high marks with naval analysts as it wields a potent array of weapons and sensors. The use of a warship class for Coast Guard service, however, follows the precedent already set by the Chinese Coast Guard, operating several cutters based on the 1700-ton Type 56 corvette. Last week, on 14 November, the state-controlled Chinese newspaper Global Times informed that China's first aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, was combat-ready after 4 years of tests and training. The picture on the slide shows the largest number of combat aircraft based on the carrier since flight operations began in November 2012. In a TV interview on 4 August, People Liberation Army Navy Rear Admiral John Chu informed that the Liaoning was intended as a base for a total of 20 fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters. This would represent what the US Navy terms a carrier air wing. Even if it doesn't change the security calculus of East Asia in the short term, the new capability indicates China's long-term ambitions. From a US perspective, 2016 started off pretty well by the Philippines Supreme Court approval of the US-Philippines Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, offering access to 8 bases for US rotational deployments of air and sea assets. In March, 5 bases were open. The US direly needs access to these bases, crucial to projecting US military power on China's doorstep. The rule of a permanent court of arbitration in Hague in July that the China's 9-line claim had no validity under international law was seen as a step forward by the US administration. Thereto, the tribunal also found that the physical obstruction of Philippine vessels by Chinese ships was unlawful. Since May, however, when Rodrigo Duterte took office as president of the Philippines, doubts have consistently been casted on the future of its alliance with the US. His statement of terminating joint exercises on 7 October was followed by statements of separating from the US and realigning with China during his visit to Beijing on 22 October. The White House responded to these statements by denoting them offensive, while arguing that they created unnecessary uncertainty in their relationship. Clearly, I would say, the back-and-forth statements of President Duterte risk disrupting not only the US ties to the Philippines, but also its ties to the Asia-Pacific. The region has been a central pillar of President Obama's foreign policy ambitions, aimed at anchoring the US in the Pacific century. It remains to be seen what policy Donald Trump will eventually pursue with regards to East Asia. Given his statements on discarding multilateral trade agreements and renegotiate bilateral ones more favorable to the US, a similar policy can be expected with regards to security alliances. Unfortunately, his victory in the US presidential elections has induced uncertainty in the US East Asian policy. His intent to pressure Japan to pay for US forces stationed in Japan have left Shinzo Abe uneasy and placed Japan's strategy of relying on the US to contain China at risk of bankruptcy. Although Shinzo Abe described their meeting on Thursday last week as cordial and candid, he refused to detail the subject of their discussions. So did Donald Trump. Prime Minister Abe, his haste to beat Trump indicates his lack of confidence in their relationship, which is particularly important since the US-Japan alliance is built on trust. I think we must ask ourselves, will Japan under Shinzo Abe accept a junior role in the US-Japan relations? I don't know. Irrespective of the answer of this question, we must bear in mind that the US cannot do without Japan as an ally if it wants to counterbalance China in theater. China, for its part, is carefully monitoring and evaluating how Trump deals with the Asia-Pacific. Arguably, China is more capable of shaping Asia-Pacific geopolitics and more confident about the direction of their relations. Following the meeting of President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin during last week's Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, China's foreign ministry declared on 20 November that they will push for a free trade area in the Asia-Pacific region. Even in Australia, a key US ally, doubts that have been voiced on whether Donald Trump will maintain the foundational elements of US foreign policy, many of which align with Australia's national interests. I draw a few conclusions here. I conclude that the economic interdependence of weaker states in East Asia and the regional power China has minimized the range of available options, although the pivot to Asia by the external power US has to offer them a viable alternative in terms of military security, but also on free trade. Proponents saw the Trans-Pacific Partnership as a multifaceted agreement knitting the US into the world's fastest growing economies, while setting US standards for trade, labor and the environment. It also served strategic and security goals of strengthening alliances against China's regional ambitions and North Korea's nuclear program. Under Trump, the US alternative to China has become uncertain. Given the current level of security pressure, I think we can expect that the role of ASEAN in Southeast Asia will be further diminished. And if the US maintains its current Asia-Pacific strategy, states of a wider Asia-Pacific region will more or less continue the process of aligning with either the US or with China. But if the US under President Trump will opt for renegotiating its regional alliance commitments, I believe that China will have the upper hand in shaping Asia-Pacific geopolitics and settle its territorial disputes bilaterally. Finally, I think that President Duterte's offensive statements have put the US-Philippines Enhanced Defence Cooperation Agreement at risk, and thus the US basing arrangements critical to US balancing of China. Arguably, they also endanger the US ties to the larger Asia-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So, can I please invite all speakers to take seats here in the panel? Steve Chan, based on a very carefully designed analytical framework, made a bold proposition about the future likely development of these disputes in East Asia. He said they will be contained. The claimants agree on one thing, to disagree. Then we had Eva Hansson's talk, where she pointed out the role of popular nationalism, anti-Chinese sentiment. This sentiment, when it is politicized, is this something that could challenge Steve's proposition? And also, Stefan Lundqvist studies the US maritime strategy in the region. There are contradictions between this strategy and the Chinese maritime development. I'm also wondering, are these contradictions also something that could challenge Steve Chan's proposition earlier? However, these are questions that I would like answers to, but I will not ask you them right now. Instead, I think we should open up the floor. We have a big audience today. I'm sure there's a lot of questions from the audience. So please raise your hand, wait until you get the microphone, and then please start off your questions by introducing yourself. We start with a gentleman over here.
The question is the South China Sea in relationship to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Then the Chinese position is, of course, in total contradiction with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that they have ratified. The US has not ratified it. That doesn't mean that the US is in total agreement with the overall provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention. Only it's against the right to the bottom of the sea minerals where the profits should go to the developing countries. Therefore, they haven't ratified. But in order to maintain its position that the South China Sea is South China Sea and not Vietnam East Sea and Philippines West Sea, they have to make one thing clear. Spratly is theirs. And will the Philippines accept that Spratlys, which are Philippine islands, should be looked upon as Chinese islands? And how could China get that accepted by the international community?
Thank you very much. I think we take one more question before we leave it to the speakers. Please.
Okay, my name is Lars Arnestam. I have a question about the possible future involvement of the USA. One reason the strongest reason for involvement would of course be commitments to their allies in the area. That may or may not change when Mr. Trump becomes president. But apart from this, as you no doubt know, USA has a very long-standing commitment to the principle of freedom of navigation that has historically been one of the pillars of American foreign policy. China has made very extensive claims to sovereignty over the waters in the South China Sea, and USA has made very clear both by words and by actions that they do not accept those claims. Would you comment about this how this may possibly evolve in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much for two excellent questions. Who feel eager to start off?
I can respond very briefly. So I want to be very clear. I'm a U.S. citizen, I'm an American, even though I have a Chinese face, okay? So, number one, China did ratify UNCLOS and the United States has not. But China has also explicitly opted out of Provision 298, rejecting compulsory binding arbitration. So China has actually opted out of that provision. The US has claimed consistently the freedom of navigation, but the United States has also violated the Cuban Missile Crisis. Certainly, the United States insisted on interdicting and inspecting Soviet and other countries' vessels going to Cuba. So when the chips are down, the question is, does the United States or other countries honor their commitments to the rule of law, right? Let me just use another example. There was a Chinese vessel by the name of Yinghe that was traveling from China to the Middle East. The United States suspected there are contrabands, components for making poison gas on that ship. Along the way, this Chinese vessel was harassed by the US Navy. Even after the Chinese president reassured the United States personally that there is no such chemical components on board, the United States Navy continued to harass it until the Chinese ship reached Saudi Arabia, where it was boarded and inspected, right? So again, I would not be too general in terms of suggesting that the United States has always adhered to its commitment on the freedom of navigation.
I'm responding to your question about the Philippines. Just one observation. When Duterte was elected, the first visit he made was to China. And he came back immediately with a lot of trade deals. And also, after this, fishers have been able to fish again. I don't know, this had not been possible to be solved before, but I think this was probably very surprising to both Japan and the US, and I think also that we should not forget about Japan, both for Vietnam and for Philippines. Japan has been a major aid donor for a long time and important ally in that way.
I will address the issue about freedom of navigation from the US. I would say it remains consistently a pillar of US strategy. And when it comes to the UNCLOS thing, China has signed the UNCLOS, but not the paragraphs on arbitration. I agree on that. I think a key issue is whether national jurisdiction is applicable in the exclusive economic zone. I think this is an issue where China has a different stand compared to the Western world and the US and international law. So that's critical. And actually, I think we should bear in mind that China pushed, when negotiating the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, actually China pushed for coastal states' right to exploit things in the EEZ. And while Malaysia and Indonesia initially opposed transiting rights, for example in the Sunda Strait, because they wanted national jurisdiction on that. And this was a trade-off. Now China is a regional power. And if you just look for the March incident with Quang Fei, I'm not very good at in March. Then the fisheries, it's about China making major fishing exploitations in the exclusive economic zone of the smaller states. And I think that even if we have a low tendency of friction, I think that the US freedom of navigation program that is actually challenging the right to this freedom of navigation, it can it risks that we have an accident, but something happens, something goes wrong, and then something escalates because there's a lot of prestige in these. And so the US is pushing, and there is a risk that the China's behavior then in the South China Sea and these reefs could end up in accidentally having ignite some kind of conflict.
Yeah, I think you're right. So I just want to say that the United States is not pristine. It has also violated international law. Speaking as an American, the United States was accused for mining Nicaragua's harbors. That case went to the International Arbitration, International Justice Court. and the court ruled against the United States, and the United States refused to respect that ruling.
Can you stand closer to the microphone?
I'm sorry. Yes, of course. Did you hear me? So again, I mean, the United States has insisted freedom of navigation in part because the United States Navy is the strongest country strongest navy in the world. So it does not want to operate with any kind of a hindrance. Should the role be reversed? One never knows.
Okay, let's take a couple of more questions, and then we see if we have time to take another round as well. The hands I saw first was these three gentlemen there, first in the blue tie, and then the black sweater, and then here in the white sweater. And then we see if we got time for more questions as well. I note your hands. Thank you.
My name is Lundqvist. I'm trying to be short. It seems like most of this discussion from Professor Chan and Stefan Lundqvist is based on the assumption that geopolitics is the name of the game, so to say. But that is actually what is changing just now when China's policy, which explicitly says this is not a geopolitical strategy, this is to help to develop the world, the whole world, not in the way the so-called liberal world order has done now. Look what they do in the Middle East and all of Africa and so on. So I think if we should understand what's going on, you have to change the foundation for the discussion because the world is totally changed now. Example, Brexit, Trump victory, Fillon victory in France, new president in Bulgaria, new president in Moldavia, and so on. All directed against this evil liberal world order.
Thank you. That's a great question. So does these monumental changes that some people believe they are recently, have they changed the game, so to speak? Do we have to speak about these issues in a different way? But before I let you respond, let's take two other questions. First, the gentleman here in the black sweater, and then the gentleman in the white.
Thank you. I'm Tom Hart, once of this institute, also Stockholm University and CSCAP and so on. I just wanted, I totally accept Steve Chan's assertment or accession, they call it, feeling about the likelihood of this not being settled, not having to be settled. I just want to make the remark that the phrase freedom of navigation is an abstract term. What we should really be aware of is volume of navigation through the South China Sea, which is absolutely colossal. Mm-hmm. And it's in everyone's interest not to have that interrupted in any, even a few weeks would be almost fatal for the world trade in that area, even for China. That makes it very unlikely, I think, that anything major will happen that would interrupt the volume of traffic in that area.
Yes, my name is Ellis Wallner, American face, Swedish citizen. I think the biggest uncertainty is Donald Trump. When the Korean War, I don't know if historical research has borne this out, but it was said that Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State, had made a speech about a perimeter of defense.
That's right.
And this gave a signal North Korea could do what they did.
Right.
Donald Trump can say anything at any time.
That's right.
I tried to read the transcript this morning of his meeting with the New York Times. There's not a coherent, concise sentence in the whole long transcript.
Leave you guessing. Keep the element of surprise. There is one thing, if I may.
Sure.
Just strategic about it, and let me just, again, be totally honest and candid. On the minds of Chinese officials, they have a big fatal vulnerability. China has become very economically dependent on supplies of foreign resources and export to the overseas markets. There's only one country that can interrupt the freedom of navigation, and that country is called the United States. The Chinese are very, very worried about just strategic reasons of being blockaded. When the United States is not going to invade China, but the United States can inflict enormous pain on China by simply closing off the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Tsushima. China is subject to being blockaded, just like the Germans were concerned about being blockaded during World War I and during World War II. That is the geostrategic reason. Hidden all behind all the rhetoric about South China Sea, that is the source of Chinese concern. Precisely because the freedom of navigation can be suspended when the moment for tension rises. They are absolutely vulnerable. They're vulnerable to blockade.
Eva, how do you read these recent changes that we have seen in this year, and especially the Trump, if not insecurities, at least uncertainty? How will this affect the situation about maritime disputes in the region, do you think?
Well, I actually think that's impossible to answer yet, because it may very well be that we will see less conflicts in the world with Trump than we would have had if Hillary had won. That is also actually a possibility. But I would like to just comment on with the changing world order and the changing liberal world order. We must also open for the possibility that is actually that China could be taking the lead to reproduce and produce the liberal world order, but perhaps minus democracy. Because China is one of the countries who possibly gained perhaps most on the free trade regimes and so on in the current order the last few decades. So we must also imagine that this might be a future as well, I think.
Thank you. Stefan, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I would say I don't see the contradiction between geopolitics being the name of the game and the liberal world order. I think that geopolitics definitely is the name of it's the name of the game, and I agree with Eva that we haven't seen. Actually, what China is stating, and Jung Sing and the foreign ministry is stating, is actually that China will assume the lead of something different. I would say maybe it doesn't be now a new liberal order, maybe a new trade order, because they are equally dependent on each other. China is dependent on oil. Also, the US is heavily dependent on rare earth minerals to have their industry in production. And I think that these are good mechanisms, and also the trade, everybody is dependent on trade. But we can also see that US and China has been checking each other, and I guess they will continue to check each other if doesn't Trump changes the whole strategy of the US. We can look at the deployment of the littoral combat ships, the smaller ones, the kind of corvettes that the US has deployed. They deploy them to Singapore. Why? Because they are supposed to be in the Malacca Strait. And why are they supposed to be in the Malacca Strait? What's the argument? The argument is that they should keep it open. But everybody knows that a naval ship can keep off pirates, can do a lot of good things, but it can also block the Malacca Strait. If it's deployed, it can have a dual use, depending on what you want to do. So there are differences here. But things are very, 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 very much changing in the world today. I just read before I came here that Turkey is considering to join the Shanghai Cooperation. So things are really changing in the world, and I think it's hard to be very precise because things are happening so fast.
Yes.
Thank you. I think we got time for 2 more short questions. I've seen more hands, but I hope that our speakers can stay along for a few more minutes. You can catch them after the seminar ends. But we have the lady in yellow, and then the gentleman in the white shirt. You had your hand up earlier on the upper row there.
Thank you. I'm Elizabeth Ferreira-Bulin, and Tom Hart was my teacher in international politics at the university. I want to address my question to you because you mentioned something about one variable, the people and their sentiment. And let me go back to the Philippines where I came from. This generation is still is glued, their mentality is still glued to America as our mother country. So regardless of China's power in the region, and so many Chinese living in my country whose patriotism and loyalty is unquestionably for the Philippines, I don't think there will be any change or shift no matter what this newly elected President Duterte is saying to break its foreign policy from America. I don't think that could be possible, at least in this generation.
Thank you very much. It's a very good question. The Filipino population is famously pro-American, so will this prevent the Filipino government from pivoting too far toward China? And then one more question, please.
Thank you. My name is Jensen. I'm the DCM at the Embassy of Norway, so within the security field and in Tokyo and Beijing previously, hence the interest for today. Very good introductions from all of you. Very briefly, could you address the, I guess this goes to Lundqvist, the issue of tactical misjudgments, the potential for that in the South China Sea, or maybe even more so in the East China Sea, at sea or in the airspace. I thought that was maybe an element that you could elaborate a little bit more on. And a second one, very briefly. There's been a gliding shift in the discussion in Japan about the nuclear option. And you mentioned the fact that Japan has been what's often called an offshore balancer for the US in strategic terms, but might want to, reassert its own role. I don't ask you to look into the crystal ball, and this could be one for all of you, but obviously that debate has moved in the recent decade. And where do you see it going from here? Thank you.
Thank you. So we got another 2 minutes to reply. So please pick and choose.
Let's go with, yeah.
Well, yes, to the question about the Philippines and the US relations, it will probably not change now. As you say, there has been such long relations between the Philippines and the US and so on. But on the other hand, it's also important what leaders do. It was a symbolic act, I think, when Duterte went to China rather than the US on his first visit abroad. So, perhaps we have to watch this and see what happens, I think.
Yeah, thanks for an excellent, but also, may I? Yes, and actually, but I think it's also a demanding question to answer. So I structure it like this: if we continue, if US would continue with the current strategy, the one that has been laid out and well implemented and also described in the documents by the current administration, well, it's a strategy of engagement. And what does I mean with engagement strategy then? It's a kind of deterrence, but it also includes certain elements of reassurance. And these elements of reassurance have been addressed a lot together by the sea services. To have this strategy of sea services, and not only US Navy, US Marine Corps and US Coast Guard are separate, but having them merged together is actually a way of working an engagement strategy in the maritime domain. That means that you could invite, which also has been done, invite China into anti-piracy things, to have exercises on whatever that is not in conflict, and then the deterrence thing could be managed by other exercises with other partners, so you could achieve a little of both. Then comes the question, and also why you do this, and we have this freedom of navigation program, which is actually pushing, it's the right of the strong one, and I would say when China will grow stronger, their behavior as a great power or superpower is likely to change as well, and they will say that we have rights. I think we see a trend at least in that direction. Then the risk of tactical misjudgments increases, because when you try to test the ability of your opponent, well, there is a high risk that you get frictions and you get misunderstandings and you go closer. So I'm a little bit afraid that under Trump that we will see less of the reassurance part and more about the deterrence part. And that means that we can see a trend upwards on this ladder of strategy, up towards more of a containment strategy. And you talked about the offshore balancing thing, and what happens if the new US administration pushes too hard on the reimbursement of US troops in Japan. It will be very costly in South Korea. What will happen if the US backs out? Then it will be definitely more and more about deterrence, and I think the nuclear option, it comes more with a containment strategy than with the engagement strategy, and I hope that we will stay with the engagement.
Thank you very much, Stefan. We got some pessimistic views today, but we also got some optimistic ones, and I hope that this seminar have made us all a little wiser, despite the uncertainty that always seems to be in the background, this point in history when we discuss international affairs. Thank you so much to all of you in the audience for coming here today, and thank you to our speakers, Stefan Lundqvist, Eva Hansson, and Steve Chan, who came all the way across the Atlantic. Please join me to give them a big hand.